turn down that alarm? Gah! You'd think when I put a big red button on something, people would know by now not to— Oh, LucasArts. Well, this'll be fun. Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. It's been an interesting couple of years for Star Wars fans, and with Rebels Season 3 appearing to reintroduce the Dark Trooper, let's look at the game which introduced them to us, Star Wars Dark Forces. If you were a gamer and Star Wars fan in the 90s, then you had the pleasure of seeing LucasArts at its prime. Not only did you have a solid development team who genuinely wanted to do good by the Star Wars name, the end result were games that were not only good, but also innovative in their own right. Dark Forces came out at an age where every first-person shooter wanted to be Doom, and if you simply took the mechanics of Doom and put them in the Star Wars universe, it would have been a fun time. However, rather than just ripping the mechanics whole cloth, they added a number of things which furthered the genre, including some things which we take for granted nowadays. Yet there's also a degree of sadness involved whenever LucasArts gets mentioned nowadays. The Disney acquisition effectively wiped all but the CGI animated TV shows, films, and new material from canon, and if that wasn't enough of a slap in the face, LucasArts itself was closed down for good. To be fair, the games released beforehand weren't all that flattering, but this was also a development team that brought us so many good games and so many interesting characters, including the subject of today's video, Kyle Katarn. In fact, Katarn is the primary reason why I was interested in looking at this game. I had heard good things about the Jedi Knight games, but by the time I was at the age where I could play them, the FPS to play were Battlefront and Republic Commando, so I never got a chance to check them out. Since then, I've heard a lot about Kyle Katarn and know his general place within the expanded universe, but I don't know him much as a character, and I've been wanting to see who he is firsthand. Though Rogue One and Rebels Season 3 are effectively killing off the Dark Forces story from happening in the new canon, perhaps there's something that can be learned for future material, even if Katarn himself might not be able to return. With all of that mentioned, I would be lying if I said I didn't have a bias going into this, and that is of someone looking to sit back and have a good time in a universe which I've become jaded by in recent years but still care a lot about. So with my expectations where they are, and the new canon making this game's story truly dead, is it worth looking back on now? Let's find out. Ordinarily for classic FPS, the story is a framing device for the gameplay, and as such I usually just give an overview and then forget its existence. However, since this is a Star Wars game and there actually is somewhat of a story here, let's talk about it. As mentioned earlier, you are Kyle Katarn, an Imperial agent turned mercenary for the Rebellion. After assisting the Rebel Alliance in acquiring the Death Star plans, your attention turns to what is known as the Dark Trooper Project. Little is known apart from some information from a Rebel spy, so your job is to figure out what the project is, where it's operating, and to shut it down at all costs. Along the way, you learn more about the Dark Troopers in question, fight past stormtroopers, bounty hunters, and other unsavory folk, eventually leading you to a confrontation with the Dark Troopers themselves. That's pretty much all there is to it, actually. There's not much to critique on the story itself, since that it does still seem like a framing device for the gameplay, so let's talk about the execution. The characters are, sadly, a bit one-note, even for the characters that we've seen in the films. Katarn himself might have been introduced with this game, but it's certainly not where his story got interesting. Thus far, I can't give too much of a read on who he is, as he ends up not saying too much, and his mission operative, Jan Ors, is mostly focused on giving you the information you need for each mission. Fortunately, when it comes to the presentation, I don't have too many complaints. Since this is a classic FPS, it is told mostly through in-game dialogue and cutscenes in between missions. Though the graphics definitely show their age, it certainly does look and feel like Star Wars, which is great. There isn't a whole lot of graphical variety, as there are only so many ways that you can change up the enemies, but they do take advantage of everything that existed in the expanded universe at that time, and did give us a threatening enemy in the form of the Dark Troopers themselves. Before I go headlong into gameplay, it should also be said that the music is really good as well, matching whatever tone each level is trying to set. It is certainly obvious when they're doing an arrangement of the film's music and when it's relying on its own work, but it does still match the circumstances well enough so that it's not a major complaint. The only issue is that the MIDI files that the game uses are definitely more retro sounding than the MP3s you can find elsewhere. So bear in mind that the music sounds a little different than what I'm able to play here. In some cases it's for the better, as it matches the old school look of the game, but there is a noticeable difference in quality all the same. With that out of the way, let's get to the most important part, the gameplay. As mentioned earlier, there isn't a huge variety in the enemies, and that comes down to gameplay differences as well. The Imperial units don't act all that differently from each other, so the main variety comes in the creatures, bounty hunters, and droids you encounter. In some respect, however, this is enough to suit the game's length, and for a reason I didn't expect. Instead of having a single unified health bar, you're given a shield meter which can go up to 200 and a health bar which goes up to 100. Explosives and blaster fire takes chunks out of your shields if you have them, while melee attacks skip the middleman and hurt you directly. It was an unexpected distinction that ended up making some encounters deadlier and by extension more tense as a result. It also means fall damage is going to be really nasty if you're not careful, so you better make sure you watch where you step. The best example of the variety though comes down to the Dark Troopers themselves. For much of the game, you're dealing with either a nasty melee trooper or a massive rocket-firing, plasma-shooting jerk, both of which have a strong compulsion to kill you. To my surprise, you don't see much of either Dark Trooper, codenamed Phase 1 and 2 respectively. For a game that named itself after them, I was surprised to have gone through a large chunk of the game before even seeing one. However, that ended up being the best decision the game could have made. You eventually learn to deal with Phase 1, as they are, when everything is said and done, another melee enemy that you take down in a similar manner to a Gamorrean guard. When a Phase 2 trooper shows up though, the only proper response is to yell "uh-oh" and to start unloading all that heavy ammo you've been saving up. The robotic jerks are extremely deadly and used very sparingly, which means that whenever you see one show up, you better be ready to either fight or run because shit just got real. Don't even get me started on the final boss fight, which for those of you who haven't played it, I don't dare spoil for you. It also worked perfectly in conjunction with what we're told near the start of the game, that these Dark Troopers are ridiculously effective. Unfortunately, that's mostly where the threatening stuff ends, as apart from one of the bounty hunter enemies and an encounter with Boba Fett, the rest of the enemies aren't that threatening. It's not that they aren't deadly in a group or completely incompetent, but the AI driving them is brain dead. I had more than one case where an enemy walked into a mine when it should have known it was there or kill itself with its own thermal detonator, and that's without going into how accurate the stormtroopers are, in that they can't hit the broadside of a moisture evaporator.
Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise.
Yeah, good joke, Obi-Wan. Admittedly though, once you pick up the Stormtrooper blaster, you quickly see why this is the case. The weapons, for the most part, have enough to distinguish themselves from each other. You start out with a dinky pistol in your fists, and as you fight the different enemies, you can pick up their weapons to use from then on. The good news is that, apart from a couple of exceptions, there isn't a weapon that is strictly better than another. The Stormtrooper blaster fires more quickly, but isn't nearly as accurate as the pistol or other weapons you find later on. The Trandoshan's concussion rifle is really explosive and very useful for taking down groups of enemies, but if you're too close to your target, then you're going to hit yourself in the process. There isn't a shotgun or sniper rifle, but given the nature of the combat in Star Wars universe, neither of those make too much sense either way. More importantly, the game actively encourages you to use different weapons by virtue of the ammunition being used. The pistol and Stormtrooper blaster uses one type of ammo, most other energy weapons use power cells, while the explosives all have their own meter. That means when you're running into a lot of bounty hunters, you'll find yourself getting a lot of thermal detonators instead of other weaponry, which means you may have to either conserve how much you fire or start using some of that ammo you've stockpiled for a different ammo type. My main complaint here lies with the controls, as this is very much an old school game in that regard. The thermal detonator has a very clear arc that it follows every time you throw it, which means if the ceiling is too low or you don't thread the needle just right, then you'll end up doing more damage to yourself than to whoever you're trying to kill. The bigger issue at hand though comes down to how aiming works. There's no reticle, which means there is a degree of auto-aiming, and when you start playing it, you'll find out why really quickly. This was surprisingly the first FPS to allow you to aim up and down, but the way you do that is by hitting page up or page down, which isn't exactly convenient when you're using your mouse for horizontal motion. The game will, for the most part, aim at the right place if it thinks you're at the right horizontal distance, but that's assuming you are far enough away for it to make that shot, all the while you're likely being shot at by whatever is on the high vantage point. Add on to the fact that the auto-aim doesn't lead the target, which means if you're firing at a far-away enemy, then you're going to need something a little more explosive to take them down. While I'm on the subject, page up and page down for looking up and down aren't the only weird hotkeys. Since this came out in an age where manuals were more common, it took me a while to figure out all the hotkeys that I needed to know. WASD still work fine, but since there's no reloading, R is used as your alternate fire, or regular fire if the weapon you're using doesn't have that. The number keys are used for weapons, as you would expect, but the F keys are used for general information and for activating a variety of gadgets, such as granting you night vision, making it easier to traverse certain areas, and so on. Most of the times I got stuck in the game were a result of not knowing about the F keys, which is apparently necessary so that I can punch certain codes into walls and actually access the gadgets I'm given. Still, the game expecting me to look at the manual is something that can, to some extent, be forgiven. But does the level design as a whole make it easier to forgive? For the most part, it does make it bearable. This was the first time that multi-layered levels were introduced in classic FPS, and they are utilized really well to give you more to keep track of. Since the classic FPS live and die by their maze-like level design, This means there were even more places to hide all sorts of stuff, to the point where I found a weapon earlier in the game than I would have otherwise due to exploring around. Not only did it measure out when and where enemies were supposed to be really well, it also added an element of puzzle solving which I didn't expect. The most extreme case of this was in a later mission where I had to figure out how to manipulate 3 different layers of security doors in order to proceed. Though it was certainly difficult to figure out, as there wasn't a precedent set for that kind of puzzle solving beforehand, it was a nice change of pace in a level that, up to that point, had been almost purely action-oriented. Unfortunately, the inability of the game to tell me things extends into the level design as a whole. There are multiple examples that I can bring up, but perhaps the worst involves a prison complex. In it, I was trying to get past a certain point and ran into something which had these flashing green doorways. When they're flashing, I can't move through them, but in this case, there was a switch I could find by going into a vent. Okay, nothing too bad thus far, and there's a similar one which I can use to get back through once I need to leave, so no problems there. However, there is another one of these a couple floors down, and what they don't tell you is that this one is playing red light green light with you. I spent a while looking around for a second switch before I looked it up online and realized that was the case, because apparently setting a precedent in one instance obviously means we need to break it in the next. Luckily for me, I had time, the internet, and an autistic brother with extremely good attention to detail to help me throughout, but those moments were needlessly frustrating. Perhaps even more frustrating, however, are the times when the game broke in such a way that I couldn't complete the level. One time, my ship didn't return to pick me up after I completed the objectives, and another time a part of the level failed to move in response to a switch I flipped, meaning I was unable to get where I needed to go. In both cases, I had to use cheat codes to get past, and as someone who hates the very concept of doing that, it left a very sour taste in my mouth. The rest of my complaints are mostly minor ones. Mines are probably more punishing than they need to be, especially given how difficult they are to see, but at the same time, I'm supposed to be moving cautiously forward, so part of the blame does lie with me. The game overall is fairly obtuse, but that falls to some degree into my biggest gripe already. For every somewhat unclear moment though, there was a lot of fun to be had, and I will give credit where it's due in that regard. There are still technical limitations that are more obvious nowadays, such as not having a field of view slider, the weird controls, and other things that can be a thorn in your side. As for game length and overall difficulty, my first time playing this was on the easiest difficulty, and for my experience with classic FPS, it was the right place to begin. The levels never seemed to overstay their welcome, apart from a couple of times where things were even more obtuse than normal, or when they outright broke. Given the level variety, the 14 missions spanning roughly 5 to 10 hours were enough to take full advantage of what was on offer without being repetitive, though beating up dumb stormtroopers will never get old. The 2 higher difficulties are certainly a challenge if you're looking for more to do within the game, as they increase how many enemies you encounter and make them more resilient. I wouldn't recommend starting out that way, so as to give you time to mess up some of the puzzle solving or platforming sections, but on a second run, I think they might warrant a second playthrough, assuming you're masochistic enough to deal with it. Overall, I had a good time going back to this game. However, part of me wants to say that it's because of the circumstances in which I played it. Between the class-based multiplayer and 6 Degrees of Freedom games which I've been playing far too much of, it was nice to play something simpler and with a nice Star Wars theme attached to it. In the end, however, the game was still fun. The shooting aspect was surprisingly enjoyable, the levels were well crafted, and I enjoyed looking back at how Star Wars fans were introduced to Kal Katarn. There are still problems such as the movement controls being wonky, some of the levels being more obtuse than necessary, and the extremely dumb AI. But if you're a Star Wars fan, let's face it, you're already reinstalling this. As to the rest of you, the decision comes down to whether you can bear the old school eccentricities to enjoy what is, at its core, a fun romp in the Star Wars universe. If you're interested, you can find a reliable copy over on either Steam or GOG. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. Okay, I've gotten past what is likely to be the most obtuse of the Jedi Knight games. Now I get to look forward to using a lightsaber again. Either way, if the rest of the games in this series are as good as this one, I'm gonna have a fun time. If you don't mind, I'm gonna go huddle in a bunker and slice up some stormtroopers. So until I emerge, I will see you all later.